Well, hello and welcome back to our watchers and listeners to Transcendent Truth Media. I'm one of your co-hosts, Pastor Roland Weisbrot, and of course, I'm here again with Pastor Connor Longaphie. It's always good to be back together. Our topic today is things like children's ministry and the role of children in church and all that sort of wonderful stuff, which we will be discussing today. But before we dive into that, just a couple of introductory notes, a couple other pieces of information worthy of note at this time. Pastor Connor has just finished his second volume of his commentary on the Luther's Small Catechism, as well as different articles of Luther. So please check that out. You can find that on our website, Transcendent Truth Media, and you can look at that. It's free, I believe, or at least very low cost, whatever.
Yeah, it's the PDFs we give out for free, and then if you buy the paperback on Amazon, that's at publication cost, like at not editing cost. It's all free in that regard. You're paying for the paper and the ink and the shipping.
Yes, so virtually free. But anyway, if you're interested in that at all, I know Connor's written extensively on some of this stuff, and I always enjoy reading what Connor has to say. And so if you're interested at all in that, that is now available. Once again, volume 2 of his commentary on Luther's Small Catechism and the other articles. And so that is very exciting. Congratulations to Connor for getting that done. That's a lot of work. So thank you very much for being willing to contribute to the wonderful conversation of Lutheranism in the 21st century by putting pen to paper and making these thoughts available to people. So that's very exciting. Anyway, without further ado, let's dive into our topic of things like children's ministry. And we're going to cover topics like VBS, Sunday school, camps for kids, all these different things that the church has done, especially in the last, I would say, 75 to 100 years, to try and attract or at least connect specifically to the children. And we'll weigh the merits of that and look at the theology behind that. So let's dive into that wonderful topic.
Oh, go on. Are you going to say something?
Sure. I was just going to say the thing that's very interesting, and I just want to admit this from the start for contextualizing for my own opinion and self. I didn't particularly grow up in the church. I wasn't in an irreligious home. I just wasn't in a particularly religious home. So I never went to Sunday school. I never went to VBS. I was never signed up for the kids camp things. I didn't go to, like youth little kid Bible study thing. Like I was never involved in any of those things. I wasn't read all those sort of, many of which I think are quite cheesy, Christian kids books. I think the closest thing to a religious education I got as a boy was going to my grandparents' house once a week and occasionally watching Veggie Tales on VHS. So that's probably the closest thing I got to children's ministry in my own life. I came into the church really as a teenager and as a young adult. And so I really didn't have those experiences. So I can't speak firsthand, but I have a lot of shall we say, opinions about the place of these ministries. So I just want to give that contextualization of my own background, because I don't want to say I'm speaking from experience in regards to these sort of specific outreach programs, because I don't have experience in terms of as a recipient of them, so to speak.
Yeah, that's helpful. For our listeners, and as well, my own sort of experience is a little bit weird. It's not identical. It's kind of the opposite, though similar in some ways. My family was not a religiously Christian family. When I was like a young child, I did attend Sunday school, and my mother was attending church, and I was attending it's not what you would call Sunday school in, for example, the conservative Christian sense. In the conservative Christian sense, regardless of theological tradition or denomination, is an all ages thing. It's usually a Bible study. But in a lot of more modern, non-denominational, that kind of thing, or centrist, I'm not sure. I don't think liberals even have children in their churches, generally speaking, these days statistically. But in centrist churches and non-denominational evangelical vibe sort of churches, a Sunday school is what used to be called children's church. And I did attend that, right? That's where the children are not it's not that they're not welcome in the sanctuary, although in some cases that may be true, but they are taught and catechized as a whole congregation to believe and understand, I would say wrongly, that children do not benefit from the all ages worship of the corporate church in gathering, but that because, and this has to do with a total shift in what they think is happening on Sunday morning, is that they will only attain to what the goal is if they have something geared toward their age bracket, which is very radically different than what is actually happening, at least in a Lutheran context within divine service. I did attend that. I also, when my parents stopped attending church, they still sent me to Christian summer camps, like overnight camps. And in high school, I was still going to those. I was going to youth groups in high school. So I am a recipient lifelong of this, though my family was not really going to church at all, which is kind of a weird place to be in. But it has enabled me to see all of these things, all of the VBSs and the Sunday school, like children's church and the summer camps and the youth groups and the young adults events and kids media like VeggieTales and Bible Man and all of this stuff. So, yeah, where shall we maybe begin this? I know when I think about my own sort of perspective on this conversation, I you know, it's not that I like to start with the positive thing, but I do, I think in this sense, it's important to acknowledge that there is a good heart in the people that are running these programs, that they want to reach children, though I don't think they always agree on what that means, of course. But there is a heart for evangelism and witness to the kids. And maybe we can start there, but then we should very soon switch over to another concern, well, a first concern I have, which is if that's understood improperly of what we mean by reaching kids or ministering to kids, then we end up de-sacramentalizing the work of God for his people in word and in sacrament. So maybe you can start us off on those two things, Pastor Roland.
Well, and this is my fundamental problem with a lot of these approaches, is in our confessions, and according to what we believe the scriptures say, hearing comes through the word, right? And hearing, faith comes through the word and the hearing of the word of God, right? I think I just butchered that, but everyone knows what I'm talking about there in Romans. So clearly we believe there's a connection between the proclamation of the word and its instantiation in the sacraments, I would say, and faith, right? So then the question becomes, if you look at our confessions and we say, what is the church? Where the people gather, the saints gather, the gospel is rightly preached, and the sacraments are administered. Okay, so then when did we decide that everyone under 18 actually needed to go and do a different sort of church and be part of a different sort of church, where perhaps they're hearing the word, at least in a micro way, in some sort of Bible lesson, like usually something simplified, such as like Noah's Ark, right? Which is a popular Sunday school one, or maybe you'll have a story about Jesus' life from the gospel, but usually very simplistic. And then you make a craft or like a little macaroni thing or whatever. But the point is, you end up getting about this much word, and the rest of it ends up being a lot of playtime. And then the question becomes, at what age then magically are the children supposed to be reintegrated back into the regular church body, right? And where in the scriptures do we see that it's prohibited or not recommended or whatever, that they aren't just involved in the service from the very beginning, right? Like the Eastern Orthodox don't have Sunday school.
They don't. But there's all, not to cut you off, but there's also, as you're saying this, I'm sure our listeners who are more attuned to church history and global sort of church theology would be aware, especially as you bring up the Eastern Orthodox. This goes back to baptism, and not only baptism, but to the whole sacramental economy of the church. In an Eastern Orthodox context, in an Oriental Orthodox context as well, and also a universal global patristic context in the early church period, when you had a baby in the church, they were born, they were baptized, they were communed, and they were confirmed in one go. And then they were entered into the full life of the church from the first minute that they were in that church building. And where a lot of this stuff comes from is a Baptistic, like an Anabaptistic inclination where they're saying that person cannot be baptized because they don't have a faith to give baptism validity. And we've spoken on that before. Maybe we can mention it again. But just in short, your faith never gave your baptism validity. Your reason never gave baptism your validity. Even your own faith, as we confess, is not something that you can produce or you can give. But as Pastor Roland said, Romans 10:17, it comes by hearing the word of God. And as Ephesians says, it's not your own doing. It's a gift of God. And as John 6 says, Jesus says there, the work of God is that you believe. It's not your work. It's something that God does in you, and it's something that God does for you. The same with all of your love and your works. All of it is God. And so when we put this into our own hands, that's where we start saying, well, this child is not ready yet. And this leans very heavily in a very dangerous way, knowingly or unknowingly, into what's called prevenient grace. And I don't mean to like burden the conversation with these ideas of Wesleyan soteriology or Molinist prevenient grace ideas. But it's this idea that there is a secondary grace that makes you more likely or more able to receive the real and true grace when you receive it in a certain way. Where this, I would say, by the way, this is always bad. This is always false and not good. But when you start saying, and the way that secondary minor grace comes to you is through a certain way you interact with somebody, then what you're doing is, I would just say, it's abject heresy. The same thing happens, by the way, when you talk to people about evangelism and they say, I don't want to come off too strong and push them away. Well, what they're saying is there is a sort of prevenient grace that's operative when I take into my own hands the way in which I speak the life-giving word that enables the person to synergistically receive that life-giving word, rather than that life-giving word actually being a life-giving word. It's not acknowledging that the person is spiritually dead in an Ephesians 1 and 2 sense. It's not acknowledging that the word actually gives faith in the Romans 10 sense. It's not actually taking into account that God is the one who feeds the 5,000 with the 5 loaves and 2 fishes we're going to see in Proper 13, or as we hear in, for example, Genesis 1. It's not going to give credence to God being God or us being dead in sin, right? It's total failure at Christian theology. And not to be too mean, but when you put that behind your evangelism, don't expect it to not work.
Well, I think a lot of this comes down to a lot of people have understood modern evangelism as a marketing problem and as a PR problem, like a public relations problem. It's, people reject Christ because we haven't conveyed the message well enough, right? We haven't been kind enough in the way we said it. We haven't been loving enough in the way that we conveyed it. And if we just found a way to deliver the message in a more compelling, compassionate, loving way, then these people who hate Christ will magically start coming to church again, right? And the problem is, I think the reason why this is particularly relevant is this is essentially the same thing that has given birth to things like children's church and Sunday school. Is we have said, well, the kids don't really understand the service, and because they don't really understand the service and they're usually just coloring or running around in the pews or whatever, or they're crying, well, we're going to put them over into someone else where we can package the gospel up in a way that they can understand, right? And doesn't that sound nice, right? We can package this up and we can give the gospel to children in a way that they can understand so that they too can hear about Jesus Christ. Now, the problem is, once again, why is it that the children can't benefit from the same thing that the adults did? Jesus literally says, let the children come to me, and rebukes people, his own disciples, for not allowing the children to come to him. And I seriously wonder, when Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is preaching all the Beatitudes and telling all these parables, you're telling me no children were around? It was all just a bunch of like men and some women?
I think what they're assuming, Pastor Roland, is that he did a separate children's sermon.
Yeah. So Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, and then he got out of the boat, and then he got out the macaroni craft and did a special children's church for the kids, right? This is where I think this is where the cognitive dissonance is for me. Like, don't get me wrong, and I'll defend it later. I do think there is a place for things like Sunday school, VBS, whatever. I actually do think there's a place for these things. So I don't want to completely throw it under the bus, but
it's not in replacing divine service.
Yes, that's my problem with it. My problem isn't that Sunday school exists. My problem isn't that VBS exists. My problem is, why are we taking children out of the divine service, which we confess and believe, at least according to our own confessions, that's the locus of salvation, so to speak. That's where the means of grace are most clearly and evidently poured out. Why are we taking our kids away from that and putting them into, let's watch Veggie Tales, let's make a macaroni craft, and I'm not saying that a lot of Sunday school teachers don't do a great job. They do. There's a lot of absolutely incredible Sunday school teachers that put a lot of effort into their stuff, and I think in many ways do a really good job. But I'm sorry, it cannot replace possibly the gifts of God in the divine service.
Yeah, you bringing up let the little children come unto me. I think a lot of them they will often cite that text against people like us and say, if you don't do, and I don't recall if you have a children's sermon. I do not, and I'm not a fan of them. But they'll say, if you don't do that, you're not letting the children come to him, right? But I think the thing that they're missing, and again, I will acknowledge their heart's good, but their theology is heretical, and I will say fully heretical. Like, I'm not going to pull any punches there. What they're missing is the fact that, on the other hand, he says to the adults, and this is teaching as he teaches, he says to the adults, unless you become like one of these little children, and the Greek word there is not for like 5-year-olds, 8-year-olds, it's for like 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds. Unless you become like these people who not only can they not cognitively understand, they don't have any linguistic capability. Unless you become like them, the words I'm teaching you won't save you, right? You won't enter the kingdom of God. So what he's saying is, unless, and I'll just rephrase it. This can be like my own version of the Message Bible, right? Unless you become totally reliant on the sacramental, creative, and performative power of the Word, and that is, unless you let go of this idea that salvation and the means of grace are this propositional exercise in which Christ is going to put forth ideas and you're going to interact with them by your reason or rational capability, you're going to hell. Unless you separate yourself from that, you're going to hell, right? Unless you totally rely on the fact that you believe you cannot believe, you cannot understand, you need faith created within you from above by water and the Word, and to be placed in your mouth in the flesh and blood of God incarnate, you will go to hell.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff is built on a false premise, right? It's built on, like you said, that Anabaptist decision theology where, oh, these children can't decide to follow Jesus. They can't they can't understand the sermon. They can't understand what's going on in the sacraments. But once again, I point back to the Eastern Orthodox. That hasn't stopped them. And this is always something that I get a kick of. Like, a lot of people will say, oh, well, you shouldn't come to communion unless you have a full understanding of what it is. To which, on the one hand, I understand what people are saying. To the other extent, I'm like, well, who the heck has a full understanding of what it is? I certainly don't. And I've spent the last 15 years of my life dedicated to studying it intensely. I still don't get it. And I think even in another 50 years, God willing, I still won't understand the magnitude of the gift, the magnitude of God's presence, the magnitude of the grace and glory present in these simple things of bread and wine, right? And so I don't get it. So I'm no more qualified in the Baptist understanding or the evangelical understanding than the little kid whose brain isn't even properly developed yet. And so in this sense, I give point to the Orthodox who actually trust that the things God gave the church are going to do the things God wants to do, as opposed to the church saying, well, actually, Lord, that doesn't work because, some arbitrary reason, the kids don't get it, the youth don't understand, because there's not a drum set in the service, the youth don't want to be there, all that sort of stuff. You need to make it more exciting, you need to make it more relatable. So we're going to throw out the things that God told us to do and replace it with crafts or TED Talks, or we'll get the cool local Christian rapper to come in and do a hip hop, Sunday school or whatever. Which, I mean, for the record, I think Flame would do a good job at that. So I don't want to.
But I think Flame would decline it.
Yeah,
Tell them to put the kids in divine service. Yeah. I mean, a lot of this it really does go back to this sort of, when you're fighting, it's usually old people who say stuff like this. No offense to old people. But, coming out of the 70s, this was their whole thing. And I don't think that they understand that it wasn't because they were breaking free from stodgy tradition, or it wasn't because they were trying to inculturate the gospel into a new context, as some people might want to attribute to them. What actually happened was that they had their brains infected by Billy Graham and his Arminian theology and ideas of prevenient grace and synergism and having a part in your own salvation. And none of it's true. It's all false, right? This is where you get these ideas of the first and second Great Awakening, or as they should be called, the Great Asleepening, right? Where people were saying we need to do something emotional, emotive, to move people, to cause them to do something with their will, rather than to allow God's word to create faith within them and to kill the sin that resides in their hearts, right? That's a work of God, if it's going to happen at all. And when they stop believing that, that's when you get these things. And again, just like you're saying, it's not that VBS is bad, it's that it's run badly. It's not that Sunday school is bad, it's that it's run badly. It's not that any of these things are bad, it's that they're run by people who don't understand the faith. And this goes back to something that I'm always hammering on, which is AC 14. And this is going to ruffle a lot of people's feathers, but I think it needs to be said. When we confess, and this we do confess, only those who are rightly called and ordained ought to teach or administer the sacraments. That word is teach, not preach in the pulpit, but teach. And the most delicate years of teaching and learning are the children in our congregations. And if we're handing that task off to the people who have been trained theologically the least, and saying it's okay because what they're teaching is supposed to be the least, then we're failing on every aspect. We're aiming at a very low bar for what we actually want to inculcate in our children, but we're also throwing away our own confession and saying, rather than it's only those rightly called and ordained who ought to teach, it's actually mostly not those people who are rightly called and ordained who will be doing the teaching. It's generally going to be the older retired women who have really never read a theology book in their life who are going to be doing this. And this I'm going to say as well, to ruffle the feathers of the conservatives that are listening. And obviously this is not all our listeners, though I do know our demographic, this is most of our listeners. If you oppose women's ordination, why do you not oppose women teaching Sunday school? Now, I know, again, this is going to ruffle most of the feathers, even among the Wisconsin Synod and the LCMS. I just don't care. It's a matter of the fact. If you want the teaching in your church to be solid and confessional, you need to have pastors teaching kids. And pastors, if you're listening, stop being so damn lazy and teach more of the children in your congregation. Don't just say, oh, it's good enough I taught their parents how to catechize the kids. Go and catechize the kids before they enter official catechesis classes. If your church has a Sunday school after for the kids, why are you not there? Right? Why are you not making sure that you're able to be there? And this, for all of in my disagreements with things like the children's sermon, one of the things I appreciate about it is that the pastor's the one taking the reins, or at least usually is, right? Now, when I do see like especially in an LCMS context, like a laywoman teaching the children's sermon, I just get so confused. Like, what are you confessing? Like, I'm really confused at what they're trying to do at that point. And I think this gets at sort of the whole sort of conversation. If we run our VBS in a way that we don't know what our confession is anymore, or we don't see how it lines up with the rest of what we understand, or it doesn't line up with, like, at least congruently with the way that we worship God and understand the delivery of faith and divine service, when we run our VBS, when we run our kids camp, when we run our catechetical schools, when we run our kids media, when we run our whatever it is that we're doing, then we probably need to adjust them and fix them.
Now, I mean, I wouldn't take such a hardline stance on lay people teaching Sunday school, although I completely understand what you're saying, and there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. I don't disagree with that. The one caveat that I would say is, if you're going to have lay people running your Sunday school or your VBS, do not just pick the person who wants to do it. Find someone that actually knows what they're talking about, or at least has been able to study, someone that you can trust is going to do a good job of it, right? Don't get the lady that's read 14 Richard Rohr books. Don't get the person who's like, I've read all the Joyce Meyer books. Like, no, right? So at least if you're going to give that task to someone else, if you're going to make that choice in ministry or as a church, I would say, like, fine, I'm willing to be a little less staunch about this. Fine, but make sure the person you're putting in charge is actually a suitable candidate to do it. Now, the other thing that I would say with regard to this question is, if you are indeed running a Sunday school program, what curriculum is being used? A lot of churches, even Lutheran churches, end up getting curriculum from evangelical churches or Baptist churches that is filled to the brim with decision theology, filled to the brim with things that blatantly contradict our confessions and our beliefs. And they're not getting Lutheran content, right? And so there are good options for Sunday school curriculum published by Lutheran publishing companies like Sola, Concordia Publishing House. I think Wells, like their publishing arm, has Sunday school. Like there's options. So pick those, right? Yes, it might not be as flashy and cool as the evangelical ones, because, nobody can beat the evangelicals at flashy and cool. But at least you'll know that they're going to be written by people, and they're often written by pastors, but they're going to be written by people who actually know what they're talking about. And that should form the basis of your Sunday school or your VBS if you're going to do that, rather than Billy Graham's VBS and Sunday school program, or, or Hillsong Church's Sunday school. It's like, no. The other thing that I would say with this too is, in addition to who you have in charge, and in addition to the curriculum you're using, once again, if you've decided to outsource this, the pastor should, at the very minimum, be checking in on these things regularly. And I also think dropping in on these sessions, at least periodically, so that the children see the pastor is involved in their training, and so that the teachers see that the pastor is involved in the training, right? I actually think, once again, if you're going to do this, I do think that is extremely important, to have that oversight and have that visible presence around, if you're going to choose this way.
And if that way is chosen, then I think, something that I think could be a sort of equalizing statement, perhaps I'm wrong, but I think it could be, is between those who are against lay taught Sunday school and those who are for it, which is, across multiple synods. Even in the LCMS, you'll find lay taught Sunday schools, of course. I don't think it should be somebody who would be not chosen to preach. And again, I'm against lay preaching. But if you were, doing the Sunday school, chances are you probably also are okay with lay preaching sometimes. And I think if it's going to be a lay taught Sunday school, I think it should probably be the person that you would choose to do the lay preaching. I don't think you should, go out there and say, well, who's best with kids? I think the first question should be, who's best at preaching the faith, right? Because that's what you want. And I think having someone who's great with kids in the room is great. And, when we talk about, well, how should this run? Ideally, in my mind, and I don't think that people who go with lay run Sunday schools would even disagree with this. I think ideally, you would have a pastor there teaching, and you would also have in the room laity who are great with kids. And that those two people, or however many people, would work together to facilitate what's going on, right? Nobody expects pastors to be equipped to run games or crafts with kids. And they don't need to, because it's not necessary. But if that's happening, you should have someone there who is gifted in that, right? Or if you have someone who's, singing like children's songs or someone, that doesn't need to be the pastor who can sing the engaging children's songs, but you should have somebody there, if you want to do that, who is good at doing that, right? Does that mean that you should have the silly songs sung? Not necessarily. Or the crafts done? Not necessarily. But it does mean that when you have a hybrid event like this, maybe that's a Sunday school for kids, maybe that's VBS. I think we could all agree, if it was just, VBS, let's say however many hours that is, what is that, like 8 hours or 5 hours or whatever, it's not going to be 8 hours of just constant preaching from a pastor. Nobody would mistake VBS for being there. So you have to have people who are gifted at the things which make VBS, or kids camp, or Sunday school, for kids, Sunday school. Now, Sunday school is a lot easier, because if you limit it to an hour, I would actually not be against just teaching kids for an hour, so long as the pastor does it in an engaging way. And I think our pastors probably need to be better at doing that, right? But to be able to say, what is this event? What's the essence of the event? And then making sure that every single aspect of that event is run by the person who's able to run that aspect perfectly. I think that's what we need to be doing, rather than saying, how can we make sure people are involved? I think this, becomes very quickly in the church, and already has, an idol of saying, well, how can we involve the most amount of people? Rather than, how can we make sure that we give the absolute best to the most vulnerable population of the congregation?
So connected to that, I think the one thing I want to point out is, and I'm sure you've observed this as well, the failure rate in terms of retention from Sunday school to youth group to church attendance as an adult. So, of course, once again, these programs are sold to us as, you need these in order to connect to the younger demographics so that they develop their own faith, so that they become faithful adults. Okay, great. Do you have any idea what the retention rate is from Sunday school to youth group, and then from youth group to regular church attendance? You're lucky if it's 5% from youth group to regular Sunday attendance. So when I was a teenager, in my late teens, I had a friend who went to a massive evangelical church, and he invited me to his youth group, and it was fine, whatever. It was a lot of fun. There was probably 200, 300, 400 people there. Okay. When we aged out of the youth group, and then you're just expected to be part of the regular church crowd, I would say maybe 10 or 15 of those people that I know of, at least, ended up then becoming regular church-going attenders of that same church. So this church poured all this money, all these resources, all these volunteers, youth pastors galore, and everything into this. And a fraction of the people did this, but ended up sort of becoming conventional churchgoers at this congregation. So once again, even from an investment perspective and from a pedagogy perspective, are we going to call this a success? Is that a success? Right? And these are kids that went from Sunday school to youth group to they went through the whole system as we were told it needed to be. The kids need this, the teens need this, and then they'll become adults, and then they'll be part of the regular congregation. But that transition almost never works. And what I really noticed was, especially the youth service at this church was very high octane. It was very exciting. The music was loud. The lights were loud and bright. The sermon was like enthusiastically given, and it was, I was so excited. Whoa, so much fun. And then you go to a Sunday service, and compared to the youth group services, it was boring, right? It was really, really boring. And so the transition breaks down. And so I wonder, okay, if this is the magical way to ensure we're discipling children and youth, why doesn't it work? Why doesn't it work?
I think that it doesn't work because it's so non-confrontational. It's a lot of the people who run these things and invented these things, which are now old people. You won't really hear this from young people because most young people have completely checked out of this whole thing. And this is why people say, and it is generally true, young people are not interested in boomer Christianity, non-denominational evangelicalism. They're not interested in consumeristic faith. They're interested in tradition, seriousness, and theological confrontation with the God, which is exactly what I'm talking about. When you talk to these old people, when you talk to these boomers about what they're doing, they're always citing this idea of we're just planting a seed. And where they actually got that from was the idea of exonerating themselves entirely from any actual accountability of whether their ministry is bearing fruit. It's all this idea of you don't know what God's going to do. You don't know how he's going to use what you've been doing in, whatever, let's call it this ministry or whatever they like to say. We're just planting a seed and God's going to take care of the seed out of sight. Now we see decades gone, the seed was not planted. There was no seed. And I could have told them that from day one. The seed is the gospel. If you don't give the gospel, you did not give a seed. What you gave was the seed of macaroni crafts, right? You gave the seed of, I really hope someone will, the love of God will somehow rub off on these people. But it's so non-confrontational. Think of VBS, for example, the way it's generally run and why it's generally run as a Christian daycare, mostly run with children outside of the congregation who will never attend the congregation. And this is done on purpose. And then people say, we're just planting a seed. You don't know what God's going to do. I could tell them, I know exactly what God's going to do with this. He's going to do nothing with this because he didn't command you to do this. And he did not attach promises to do this, right? You look back at our Lutheran theology, you know where the promise is found? It's in word and in sacrament preached in the ordinary economy of the church, which is divine service. You want to plant a seed, then you go to divine service, right? And when we talk about theological confrontation or ecclesiastical confrontation, which is like real children's ministry, if you want real children's ministry, you join the church. Right. And when you teach those kids, it needs to be toward the end of bringing them into the church. And a lot of these children's ministries, they're not telling these kids that they need to join the church. They're not telling these kids that they need to be baptized. They're not telling these kids that they need to actually believe the gospel as it's preached to them. They're just telling these kids something so vague about Samson, about David, about Noah, and hoping that somehow they're going to, boom, wow, let's join the church. Right? Even though, of course, the church is nothing like VBS, the church is nothing like their kids' ministry, the church is nothing like children's camp, right? And then, this also sort of brings up the question: how then ought we to run these things, right? If you're talking about Sunday school for kids outside of divine service, run divine service first or run it after, and then have your Sunday school thing, right? And you need to make sure that you insist that the people in the Sunday school are also in the divine service. And you need to make sure that at the center of that Sunday school is the preaching of the gospel to those kids, not the preaching of how good Noah was, not the preaching of how good Samson was, not the preaching of how interesting it is that there's so many animals in the ark, but a preaching of Christ with his side ripped open at the point of a Roman spear, his heart pouring its blood out onto the earth. And people say, oh, that's so graphic. Sorry, that's the gospel, right? And telling those kids, you need to repent, you need to believe, you need to be baptized, you need to become Christian. You need to. And then, we talk about VBS, probably for a while, don't run it, probably, because I think people are so drugged up on this idea of exonerating themselves of the need to evangelize by saying, well, we did daycare for some kids in the community every summer. Like, that's not good enough, right? That's not good enough. If there's no absolute insistence that children that are attending these events are also attending church, then these events are useless, right? And if those events aren't bringing kids into the church, then they're useless. This whole idea of planting a seed is useless if the seed of the actual gospel is not present, right? And the actual gospel is not present there without demands of God for them to join the church.
Well, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier about viewing evangelism as a marketing problem rather than a proclamation issue, right? Where we go back to, well, if we just have a fun enough VBS for the kids, and these neighborhood kids who have never stepped into a church once and their parents don't even go, but they just wanted the free daycare or whatever, which unfortunately there are a lot of people like that. They just use VBS programs as free daycare over the summer. That's a reality. And then we say, well, hopefully if they had enough fun, they're going to come back someday because, yeah, like you said, we planted this seed. But the problem is, I'm currently serving a church that over 20, 30, 40 years has probably had thousands of kids go through Sunday school and VBS. Then you ask, well, how many of those people actually attend church? Virtually zero. Yeah, I can probably count on one hand the amount of people that went to Sunday school here or VBS and then ended up coming to church because of that, right? The only ones that still attend church are, shockingly, the ones whose families were already attending the church, right? It's not these random people that had come in once. They had a lot of fun at VBS. They played all these games. They heard all these stories about how many animals were on the ark or whatever. And they were told about how much Jesus loves them and that they're created in God's image. And all these things are wonderful and true. But there was no follow-up. There's no imperative placed on them. There's no confrontation of the sin and of the family. There's just, gee, I sure hope these kids come back someday. And shock, awe, they don't. And so I have constantly been making this argument for years because a lot of people, like, this is a sacred cow for a lot of people. Well, you can't get rid of VBS. You can't get rid of Sunday school. And I'm like, okay, please explain to me how all this money, all this effort, all these volunteers, all these people has benefited the church. And then, of course, they sit there and there is no answer to that because it hasn't. But what do? Like you said, Connor, they say, well, but we planted a seed, right? So it's, this is where it's hard. But now, in defense of these things, I do want to be fair in this because, we've been beating on these things pretty severely. But I want to be fair to this. My wife grew up with all of the Sunday school stuff, all of the youth group stuff, went to catechism because she grew up in the CRC, like the Christian Reformed Church. She went to all the VBSs and whatever. And she talks about how it was extremely beneficial to her. She did have a lot of fun. She grew in faith. She had really good teachers. It challenged her. But what was the difference between her and the other people in those programs? Her family was devout at home as well as at church. They were there every Sunday. They prayed at home. They read the Bible at home. The faith was practiced and modeled in the home, in addition to going to Sunday school and VBS and all these other things, right? But the people who only had the VBS and the Sunday school and whatever, guess what? They're not in church anymore. And I always laugh at this too, because people are like, oh, you must have grown up in a religious home to become a pastor. You must have, really loved Sunday school and stuff. And I just laugh because I'm like, I never went once. And all the people who went, because I went to a Christian school for most of junior high and high school, virtually all the people that were raised in Sunday school and youth group and whatever, they aren't in the faith anymore. They've rejected Christ. And here's the guy who's never had a lick of Sunday school. And I'm a pastor. Right. And so does this work? Right. Like, even apart from the theology, does this actually work? Is it a marketing problem or not? And it's not.
When it's done properly, which is not as an evangelistic thing, but as a catechetical thing for our kids in the church, it works, but only when it's done properly. Right. And I know everybody, a lot of people think that I'm very strict and things, and of course you do as well too. But if I said to most people, hey, do you think getting all the kids in the church together with the pastor and he's going to catechize them in the small catechism every single summer, do you think that would be beneficial to their catechesis? Nobody's going to say no. The question isn't about that. The question is, do you think getting a bunch of untrained people to play games with them and tell them about Noah and Samson and David will convert people who aren't Christian when they're kids? No. That's the answer. No, right? If we run these things as catechesis and we run it in the best way that we know how to run it, will it work for the end of catechesis of the children that are already in the church? Yes. But to do that, we need to totally revamp and reconsider, first of all, what do we think we're doing here, right? Because if you take back, obviously, that sacramental nature of all ministry, and then you say, let's put that into what we're doing, that means that these need to be baptized kids, right? They need to be in the church. They need to be in that ecclesiastical economy of Christ's community, right? That's what they need to be. That's step one. But then when we go and we talk to them in this setting, whatever that is, whether that's a summers camp, a lot of Lutherans in Ontario, especially in decades past when there was more of them, and also in New York State, a Lutheran summer camp was huge. And I know it is out west as well, right? But to run those things well, most of the kids there were baptized. Most of the kids there were preached to about their baptism. You have chapel services daily, if not more than daily, plus long Bible studies with the singing of hymns. When, as you know, I just came back from a Lutheran Bible camp, and there we were with the kids chanting the Psalms, making the sign of the cross, chanting the liturgies of the church. Were there games played? Yes, there were games played. But the point of what was happening was not evangelism. It was catechesis to the baptized. It was catechesis to the baptized. The echoing forth of what is already true in God sacramentally proclaimed out over them. And when they go home from that, their faith is strengthened, not because they received something special, but because they received what is ordinary twice or three times a day in the summer. And what's better to do in the summer? You say, well, we're going to go camping. Okay, you can go camping. How about you bring your kids in for catechesis, right? That's a great idea, especially as many churches take a break from normal catechesis sessions in the summertime. So when we understand this for summer camp, a summer way of administering, and VBS as well, a summer way of administering the ordinary means of grace catechetically to our kids, will it work? Yes, it will work. But if we think this is a new way to do evangelism, we're absolutely off our rockers. We've absolutely lost the whole plot if we think that this is evangelism. And the same is true, by the way, for divine service. Divine service is not for evangelism.
It's very interesting because, and this is the final nail I want to put in the coffin of evangelism being a marketing problem. Are you going to be able to preach the gospel in a more loving and convicting way than Jesus Christ? And there were people that rejected him. And do you really think you're going to go to Jesus and be like, hey, bud, if you would have just been a little nicer in the way that you condemned the Pharisees, if you had just spoken with a little more love to these Pharisees, but literally, I know this sounds blasphemous because it is, but my point is, this is how ridiculous it is. Tell these people to go and tell Jesus that actually the reason they didn't, a bunch of people rejected him and didn't believe in and didn't follow him is because he didn't pitch the gospel well enough. Make that argument and see how stupid it sounds. Right. And so you now think 2,000 years later, with your modern marketing tools and with your big heart of love and tolerance, that you have now found the formula to convert the Pharisees of our time, to convert the Sadducees of our time, to convert the unbelieving pagans, to convert the cultists of our time, because you said the gospel nicer than Jesus did. Right? That's how crazy it is to view evangelism as a marketing problem. That is insane. When you really put it down and you really break it down and you really look at it, that's insane.
Yeah, amen. And, I think when we talk about this, it also makes me think of the insanity of trying to evangelize. And this, again, I don't want to shock anybody, but just to point out like what the church has been doing over the last several decades, purposely trying to evangelize and convert children without trying to evangelize and convert their parents is absolutely bonkers, because those children cannot drive themselves to church. Those children are not lords over their own lives. Their parents are. Their parents do. Their parents can. The church for so long has totally ignored the need to evangelize adults with this hope that, again, they can plant a seed, rather than actually evangelizing adults, teens, young adults, those people who will then have children and bring them. And this is, again, not to ruffle any feathers, but like, what do we think is going to happen? These kids will be converted and then request baptism. Most of our churches have policies that we are to catechize before baptism for the unbaptized, right? Unless they're the children of converted parents, which they're not. And then what are you going to do? You're going to have on your congregational membership a child who's attending at your church without his parents. So how does any of this make sense? You're purposely evangelizing people who will then be forced to commit apostasy. It doesn't make any sense, right? So we really need, but and what we get out of this whole idea of children's ministry as evangelism, and we understand children's ministry as catechesis and children's ministry as faith formation. That enables us to make sure that those, at least to try and make sure that those children, when they are taught faithfully and we run the church faithfully, and catechize also with the programs we run, because that's what our programs are doing. If I tell my church you have to pull all the kids out of divine service because they can't benefit from it, I'm catechizing them about the divine service being useless, right? But if I tell them, and we did do this at St. Matthew's, like we no longer have VBS at St. Matthew's, we no longer have children's church at St. Matthew's. And in doing so, and pulling all those things out, there was a catechesis of program. Because what was said was, anytime we run a program because we think the divine service doesn't work, we're committing heresy. So step back from that. Say, this is enough. This is where the seeds are planted. Let's focus on watering the ones God has already planted through baptism. Let's focus on watering the baptized and making sure that our retention rate's 100% or as close to 100% as possible. And let's make sure that those 100% have lots of kids, right? And this isn't saying, screw the world. The world can go to hell as long as we have lots of kids and do things like, some kind of conservative Dutch Reformed cult or something where they have 100% retention rate and giant churches, but they're all Dutch, right? Something's gone wrong there. That's not what I'm saying we should do. What I'm saying is, with our evangelism, you need to make sure that the people you're evangelizing can actually even be baptized in your church and be members, rather than being 5-year-olds. I don't think I'm saying anything that's like not irrational here when I say that. I don't think that's crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, this is just the natural, I think, conclusion from our own theology, right? If we do believe in the divine service, and we believe in the means of grace, and we believe that these things happen in the way that they happen, and I believe we do have a solid biblical and confessional and historical reason for believing these things, then maybe we should act them out instead of doubting them and saying, actually, these things don't work, so we're going to create something new, which was never mandated, which was never commanded in Scripture, and which ultimately, quite frankly, in my view and in my experience, has widely failed. It has failed. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of children have gone through these programs, and they are not believers. Our churches are not full of these people who we were told if we just had Sunday school, if we just had a youth group, then we would have millions of these people then lining up to be in church. And guess what? It didn't happen. So I don't know if there's anything more to say. If you have some last words, that's good. But I really don't know what else to say to this topic. It's an important topic. Obviously, our children are of utmost importance. But we need to revisit this. We need to rethink this, because what we've done the last 100 years is evidently and manifestly not working.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, the only last words from me are, as we look at this as churches, and many of us are in churches now with younger pastors, or we ourselves are younger pastors, we have a a task and an option before us, which is that we can either continue doing things as they have been done, or we can call into question what is being done and ask if it's really lining up with the faith we confess and expressing it well. And when we do that, I think we really have two things we need to really take the reins on. One of those is doing a far better job at making sure our retention rate gets way higher than it is through properly catechizing our kids, our teenagers, our young adults, and our old people. And then making sure that they go and have lots of families, right? This antinatalism spirit has really ravaged not just the church, but the whole country. And not just the country, but the whole church too. And so we need to be proactive in that. On the other hand, bringing people into the church through evangelism does work, and it's not that difficult. But a lot of our pastors are either not interested in doing it, or they're too overworked to be doing it. But going and calling, you say you have a family and one of the members is missing, call them, go and see them. Or if you have one person from a family, ask if you can meet their relatives. Go and build relationship with people. Relationships do work. Having coffee with people does work, so long as they're not 5 years old and can't drive to the church, right? Be realistic with your evangelism, but be active in your evangelism and go and actually do it. We talk about planting seeds. I don't think we should use that concept because it's been so absolutely abused over the decades. But if we said, let's go and actually tell people of Christ, that's not hard to do. And it does work. We just have to go and do it. So those are my closing words, and I thank you all for joining us. And I do, if your church has any of these ministries, do speak up and lend a hand if you're able to help out with them in shaping what they look like, or in maybe even in changing what they look like. Or if your churches don't have any ministries for the catechesis of children, ask about starting one, because the catechesis of children is deeply important. And if your church has no children, ask why that is. And if your church has no young families, ask why that is and go and get them, right? They're out there in the community. Some church has them. And if they don't have them, then Satan has them. So you should go and take them from him, right? So anyways, God bless you all. And we thank you. And we'll see you next time.